My name is Dale Tafoya, and with me is Roy Eisenhardt, former A's president, beginning in 1980 when Walter A. Haas Jr. purchased the A's from Finley in August that year. I've had the honor to interview Roy for both of my books. My book, Billy Ball, of course, is available for purchase everywhere online. And when you think of Roy Eisenhardt, I mean, Roy's influence on the game transcends the Oakland A's. I mean, he played an instrumental role in the introduction of computers in the game. Roy brought in the great Sandy Alderson in 1980 and eventually hired Steve Boros as A's manager after Billy Martin left to manage the 1983 Yankees. Boris was notorious for using the Apple computer to help him manage the A's. And as Lee MacPhail, the former American League president, said when the Haas's purchased the A's on August 23rd, 1980, we've had some interesting owners in baseball over the years, but we've never had a college professor. Roy, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I never heard that line. That's kind of embarrassing.
Roy, it was a compliment. Roy, in the late 1970s, you were a professor at Cal Berkeley and also coached that men's rowing crew there. How did you become involved in the Haas family's purchase of the A's in 1980?
Well, I always tell people the secret to getting a job as president of the A's was marrying the owner's daughter.
Okay.
And so I just was lucky enough that when Walter first received some feelers from some business people in Oakland about buying the A's to keep them in Oakland, he turned to me because at that time I was teaching law at Berkeley, but I had been practicing law for 13 years doing business type law, so I was pretty prepared to kind of scope out the transaction and help him with the business side of buying a baseball team, which has a lot of interesting, subtle ramifications that we tend not to think about every day. Anyway, that's how I got involved. I was married to Walter's daughter, and happily, and still am, and so I was kind of the logical go-to guy for him to talk about.
And Mr. Haas, of course, Roy, was a wealthy philanthropist, the chairman of Levi Strauss at the time, and in many ways, besides being the chairman of Levi Strauss, you were a son-in-law. The Haas family, to this day, is very community-minded. How important was it for the Haas family to wed the A's back to the community after they purchased that team in 1980?
Well, actually, that was the driving motivation. There were rumors, I can't assign how true they were, but there were strong rumors that Charlie Finley was going to sell the team to an owner in Denver and move the team there. There were a lot of people who figured that was a fait accompli, that the Bay Area wasn't large enough to support two teams. So when the approach was made to Walter, really the point of it was not to figure out how to buy a baseball team and have fun sitting behind the dugout, but how to keep the team in Oakland, because as we all know, there are tremendous secondary meanings to having a professional franchise, particularly baseball or football, in your hometown. And Oakland, not everybody knows the history of Oakland, but it was always kind of a stepsister to San Francisco for some reasons that were geographical, some reasons that were not. And so for Oakland to lose the A's, in our judgment, would have been a tremendous blow to the Oakland community, would have turned around being a tremendous blow to the Bay Area, because even though we're subdivided geographically into different cities, effectively as an economic and social unit, the Bay Area is just one place. So damage to Oakland was damage to everybody, and Walter's main goal was to acquire the team, put it back on its 2 feet, and keep it here.
And the A's are still in Oakland today, 40 years later.
Yeah, very definitely. Yeah.
Right. And not too many people, Roy, can say today that they met Charlie Finley. You did, of course, during that purchase. I mean, in your experience with Finley, I mean, I'm fascinated. What was Charlie Finley like?
Oh, he was a fascinating guy, irascible, a bargainer for sure. You thought you had a deal, and then all of a sudden you didn't, and a new condition would just come in over the transom. But he was a guy who was self-made, pretty much. He knew that he was smart. He had an ability to go around and get a bunch of opinions from people free, and then make his decisions based on the various data that he was able to get. So he was a very clever guy in a lot of ways. I don't think I would have been his best friend, but he was an interesting guy and pleasant enough to be with.
And when you got on the scene, Roy, Finley had hired Billy Martin in February that year as manager, and Billy was really creating some fun and excitement surrounding the A's in his hometown when he returned. The A's drew just under 307,000 in 1979, as you know, and he tripled attendance in 1980. Billy was your on-field manager when you purchased the A's. How excited were you to work with Billy Martin? You grew up in New York, and you told me in the past that you remembered him playing for the Yankees.
Oh, yeah. No, Billy was an icon in my mind, having remembered his play with the Yankees. He was, what we call a dirt player. He didn't mind getting his uniform messy, and he just had a way of competing that turned into winning, and he brought that player ethic to the way he managed teams. He really wanted to win, and everywhere he went, he took a somewhat moribund franchise, starting in Minnesota and Detroit and Texas, and turned them into a winner for at least a few years. And so the opportunity, I remember the first minute that I walked in to meet Billy, and I was expecting to kind of have my head chewed off, because here was what did I know baseball, and suddenly I was his boss. But instead, he couldn't have been more gracious and cordial, and it remained that way the entire time he was there. If I could have a minute, I'd walk into his office and say, Billy, hey, I don't understand, on hit and run, when does a second baseman break and go to second base? And he would go into a long explanation for me. He was a fantastic teacher, and I actually think Billy should be in the Hall of Fame, not for his playing as such, but for the overall contributions that he's made to the game of baseball.
And after the 1980 season, Roy, the A's finished in second place, and they drew over 800,000. They drew only less than 307,000 in 1979, as we discussed. And the Haas made Billy Martin the director of player development that November, in addition to his managerial duties. What was the thinking, Roy, behind giving Billy that position?
Well, there was if you looked at the organization chart when we bought the team, there was I think there were something like 4 or 5 full-time employees. And the baseball side was really thin. There were only 4 minor league teams. There was no scouting director, and there was no general manager. Billy effectively was doing that work. Carl Finley, Charlie's brother, did a lot of the minor league paperwork and making sure that players cleared waivers and all of those technical things. But Carl was not a baseball operations guy. So really what I did was not take and give Billy somebody else's job, but I simply expanded Billy's responsibilities to fill what was at that point a gap in the organization, because Billy could judge players as well as anybody, and so why not get a 2-for-1? Let Billy be the director of the player development as well as managing the team. And he liked that, actually, for a lot of reasons. One of them was he didn't have a boss. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Billy, I think that was good, because that would have just been leading to a meet and a solve or mediate disputes between Billy and some unknown person. So by putting Billy fully in charge, it was really very simple and streamlined.
Yeah, Roy, how would you, I mean, Billy is such a fiery, larger-than-life personality. I mean, how would you give Billy Martin feedback, or if someone in the organization disagreed with him? I mean, how did that work?
Well, let's talk about me giving him feedback and then somebody else in the organization, because those are two different dynamics. I found it very easy, although I was far be it from me to second guess Billy with regard to game decisions and so forth. But, I would give Billy more feedback in the area of, we're about to go into the playoffs. Let's kind of lighten up on the umpire arguing stuff, because I don't want you suspended for 10 days when we're going into a playoff period, things like that. And he took that quite well. He understood where I was coming from. It was in his best interest. Mm-hmm. Mediating between Billy and somebody else wasn't always easy, but by and large, whoever the somebody else was going to be probably given less of a presumption in terms of their opinion, because I respect Billy's baseball judgment so much.
Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite parts in the book, Roy, and I don't think I've ever told you this, is after Billy and some of the coaches kind of roughed up his office in August of 1982, the next day you came in and you personally helped repair and paint some of the walls there, and you were quoted as saying, "This is the price I have to pay because I like Billy Martin a lot." Could you talk about that?
That was one of those things where the value of a person, and so they do something that, like, tear up their office. And it was after a particularly bad loss, so I get it. I have my share of TV remotes that were broken against the wall. But the whole idea was, look, these things happen. We all get agitated and hot in the moment of losing a bad game, and I wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. It was just property. It was just paint, and so I didn't do so much of the work myself, but I had Frank Shinchek and Steve Vucinich make sure that his office got put back together, and that was the end of the story. There was no need to make a big deal out of it, and that was the message I was trying to send to Billy. I don't care if you go off. It just means that you're committed to winning, and I'm committed to winning, and so we'll just repaint your office and move on.
And as you mentioned, Roy, the A's front office, when the Haas's took over, suddenly grew from, 6 staff that Finley had in the late 70s to over 40 almost overnight. The Haas's poured a lot of money in the farm system and scouting department from day one. And the Haas's, they said they wanted to build that club through the farm system. And you boasted about and the A's boasted the baseball's premier farm system by the mid-'80s. As new baseball owners, what made you prioritize that farm system, Roy?
Well, some of it was just luck, but let me say that before I go to that, evidence of that is that we had Rookie of the Year playing on our team for 3 years in a row in the mid-'80s.
Yes.
Walt Weiss, Canseco, and McGuire. And that was evidence of the farm system, and that doesn't count people like Kurt Young and Mike Gallego and Tony Phillips and a lot of players I could also name. But it struck me when you get into baseball, there's two ways you're going to approach this, given the fact we were going to have to almost start from scratch. The 1981 year, where we actually had a winning record and were in the playoffs, was, I thought, somewhat aberrational. The bottom line was that we really needed to kind of get down to the studs and start afresh. So there's two ways to do that. One is to try to build it through free agency, which is a quick fix, expensive, but it's hard to sign 30 or 40 free agents that are going to create a ball club down the road. The other way is to start with your farm system and your scouting, get the players with talent like the Walt Weiss's, Mark McGuire, Canseco's, Gallegos, Tony Phillips, people like that, and build with the notion it's going to take you 3-4 years until you have a very competitive major league team. But that was, to me, a much more orderly and predictive way to go about it. We made some key trades also, acquiring Carney Lansford and trading Ricky Henderson for 5 players from the Yankees. But all of that was to develop the base of talent so that we could, by, I'd say it was 1987, when we first put out what I think was a representative and competitive major league team. We finished behind Minnesota that year, but 1988 we went to the World Series, and 1989 we went to the World Series. So I think the formula worked.
Yeah, that 1987 season, I believe you guys finished 500, and McGuire, that was the year he hit 49 bombs and was Rookie of the Year.
Right, and he might have hit 50, but his wife was having a baby, and he left early.
Right, yeah. Right. That was another product of the farm system. 1984 first round draft pick, 10th pick overall, Mark McGuire, yeah. USC.
Yeah.
And 1981, Roy. I mean, the beginning of 1981 was this baseball carnival in Oakland. I mean, the A's started the season 11-0, which was the best start in baseball history at the time. Eventually went to 7-1 and 20-3. Billy was on the front cover of Time magazine, and the A's starting staff donned the cover of Sports Illustrated. The story of the A's resurrection was the national story, and they owned the front page. And the Haas's were baseball owners less than a year, and your club was taking baseball by storm. What was going through your mind during that renaissance in the early part of 1981?
Well, it's an interesting question. Actually, I guess this shows the fact that when you're in baseball, you have to take success with a grain of salt, because it's so easy for the card to flip over, and all of a sudden it seems like you're never going to win a game again. I was, honestly, during that season, I was obviously delighted with it because it gave us a good chance to establish a fan base and get a lot of enthusiasm around the team. But those are intangibles. I was worried that it was going to cause us to overvalue our current talent, and it was going to be harder to explain a strategy, as I described earlier, for a long-term build, relying on the farm system and drafts and some selective trades, and eschewing the free agency market, really, because that was too much of an allocation of resource into 1 or 2 players for our team at that time. So while I was enjoying it, I was also worried about whether this was going to foreclose our realistic evaluation of where we were and what our strategy should be going forward. Towards the end of 81, actually, we really started tailing off the team. I mean, we did make the playoffs because that was that odd year with the strike in the middle, and they had the two seasons to it, and we played Kansas City in a playoff and won that, but then we lost to the Yankees 3-0. So we had a good cold bucket of water of reality in our face, really, by the end of the 81 season. So even though it was great and it was fun to look back on and so forth, I viewed it as just a start into what was going to be a long Sisyphean-like uphill climb.
Yeah. What was your take on that 81 strike, Roy? I mean, the A's, as we mentioned, they drew over 800,000 in 1980. In 1981, you guys drew over 1.3 million, and this is minus 22 home dates that the strike took away.
Right, in the summer.
Right.
Yeah. Which is usually your higher attendance.
Great point.
Period. My view on the strike is separate from how it impacted us. I thought that That strike was kind of the dying last breath of the owners' rebellion against the Messerschmitt decision in '76 that had declared players to be free agents if they played for a year without a contract. That was a radical change in the structure of baseball, and it took a while for the ownership side and the player side to actually figure out what were the long-term consequences of this. So there was a certain amount of thinking on the ownership side that maybe we can turn the clock back to the way it used to be if we just play hardball with the union. And that's really what that strike was about. It was about a silly issue over compensation if you signed a free agent from another team. It was in and of itself kind of not a big deal, but the principle of it was huge to both sides. So it ended up being a strike. It's kind of like it was kind of the strike to nowhere because everybody lost by it.
Right, yeah. And as you mentioned, it sounded like the owners were still upset about the introduction of free agency. And
yes, well, it was a legacy of, a lot of owners at that time had been owners pre the Messerschmitt decision in '75. So they were thinking about baseball the way it used to be, where you had absolute control over your players for their entire career. And that's what the Messerschmitt decision did, was change that, so you no longer had that absolute control. And so it really, what changed the mentality of baseball was a turnover in ownership to a great extent. Some of those older owners got out of the game, brought newer owners in who were more used to the notion that labor has negotiating rights. And so gradually the culture of ownership changed, and I think that's the reason that all eventually quieted down, at least until 1994.
In 1982, Roy, is just so a fascinating season to me about the A's. I mean, 1982 was a miserable year record-wise for the A's.
Yeah, I would call it a nightmare.
Yeah, and in the standings, they finished in 5th place with a record of 68-94. But by 1982, also, each of the A's farm clubs, the A's farm clubs were bankrupt in the late 1970s. By 1982, each of the A's farm clubs finished in 1st place, and Baseball America tapped the A's as the organization of the year. And also the Haas introduced those new A's uniforms that season.
Yeah.
And that was also Billy's final season managing the A's. He was fired during the 1982 World Series. What did you take out of that 1982 season, Roy?
Well, I repeat what I said before, that 81, in a sense, the success of 81 was a false shining object that could distract you from the fact that we really didn't have the depth in our farm system, for example, to compensate for injuries, to get a better infield. We had a great outfield, but our infield defense was very questionable. Our pitching started to develop shoulder injuries, which happens on all teams. And so what I realized was that this was a year of reckoning, and that we were going to have to, again, get an attitude about who we were that wasn't looking to be a dominant team yet, but to be a team that was interesting to watch. A lot of young players who were in a steep learning curve, and the odds of our winning any particular game were less than 50-50, but if you came out to the Coliseum, you'd see a good baseball game and have a good time. And that's kind of what I tried to explain to people. Don't come to the game if you have to see the A's win. Come to the game if you want to have a good time.
Right.
And, the winning is secondary.
Right. Hey, Roy, thanks so much for your time.
Hey, my pleasure.
Billy Ball was a blast. Thanks again.
Thanks, Dale. Bye-bye.
Okay.